Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. The average large enterprise has 24 million vulnerabilities. The good news is only 5% will probably be exploited. But which 5%? That's where Kenna comes in. Kenna Security's modern vulnerability management technology combines real-time threat intelligence, data science, and automated risk analysis to prioritize the vulnerabilities that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Team up with Kenna Security and make the most of your limited resources. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Kenna Security. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. And I forgot to tease this in the first segment. We've got a big announcement coming up in the last segment, so make sure you stay tuned for that. I'll tease it here. And at the top of the next segment, there'll be a big announcement, so make sure you stay tuned. We've added Mr. Joff Thayer into tonight's show. Joff, welcome.
Hello, Paul. It's good to see you. I'm glad to be here.
Nice to have you. Quick announcement before we jump into it. Security Weekly is ramping up our webcast technical training schedule for the rest of 2020 in September. Learn how to extend the enterprise for remote workers and protect your home network. Find out why traditional data security can't be zero trust. And learn how to reduce the blast radius of your cloud infrastructure. securityweekly.com/webcast or /on-demand for previously recorded webcasts. Justin Armstrong is responsible for the security of Meditech applications and platforms, including coordinating critical updates to Meditech software and communicating with customers when questions arise about Meditech's security stance. Justin stays up to date on evolving security standards and regulations, best practices, threats, and software vulnerabilities by remaining active in the security community inside and outside of Meditech. Justin, welcome to Paul Security Weekly.
Oh, thank you. A real pleasure to be here. Honored to be here, and nice to see fellow Star Wars fans as well.
Yes, I see you've got some Star Wars paraphernalia back there. Very nice, very nice. Yeah. Justin, how did you get your start in information security?
Well, that's kind of a funny thing. My main interest was in espionage and ciphers and things like that when I was a kid. I came across a book about the history of cryptography, and I just found that fascinating. And I've kept an interest in espionage ever since. It's like a pet hobby of mine. And it's so closely related to cybersecurity. And it's kind of funny how you see like the things that people were using for nation state espionage years ago, like buttonhole cameras, are now, $12 on Amazon with free shipping. So it really has opened up what I would call the golden age of espionage. And we've seen that a lot of cybersecurity dovetails with that, whether it's an insider threat or a nation state hacker. So that's my main thing. I've always kept my toe in it, and I've been into computers since I was 10. I started out as a developer at Meditech once I left college, and I've been there for over 20 years now. And I've always kept my toe in security, but then when this role came up about 6 years ago, I leapt at it, and I already had a reputation for the guy who brings up security issues, so that helped. And I also have a lot of background with presenting to our staff, educating on technical topics. So it's been a blast. I love it.
Medical devices is certainly interesting, and I noticed in your bio that it said something about actually updating medical devices with security patches. I found that to be refreshing, as oftentimes we cover medical devices that aren't updated with patches and firmware updates.
Yeah, so actually, at Meditech, we're mainly electronic health records, but we integrate with medical devices, and we also have certain aspects of our software that are actually regulated as a medical device. And so it undergoes a very rigorous set of controls. The design control for everything that you do is so elaborate, and then it has to be approved by the FDA. But thankfully, over the years, the FDA has come out and said, as long as there's been testing that these things don't break critical functions, you can take cybersecurity patches. So that's been good to see, but we still have a long ways to go.
I'm always fascinated, Justin, as to the number of different types of software and devices in a medical facility like a hospital that need to communicate but do that securely. What in your experience has been some of the more challenging things in that aspect, and how have you overcome them?
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes from my perspective, if I hadn't visited a lot of hospitals and talked to a lot of CIOs and security people, I would have just thought everything was rosy, because at Meditech, one of our big values is that we have a very integrated system. And so you can control everything in the hospital through that. But that's not the reality. Most hospitals have like 8, 9, 10 different electronic health record systems, and they all interface with each other. So they may have something for pharmacy, something for lab systems, something for materials management, a totally different software package for accounting. And then they integrate with the medical devices. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. So a lot of them, what they'll have is, for instance, at your bedside, they'll scan a barcode on your wrist, and then they will have the medical device check in so that you can identify that medical device is now hooked up to this patient. And then they have to sync up the time to make sure that's accurate. Otherwise, the data could be all wrong. And they have to throw out bad data. So there's a lot that goes on there. But thankfully, people have pretty much mastered it. Like right here, in some ways anyway, here at Mass General Hospital, for instance, in Boston, there's a lab that does a lot of research on medical devices, and they investigate these things in great detail, always looking to improve it. So that's pretty exciting.
And does that also tie into the patient's images as well, and moving those around? Is that part of Meditech, or is that other software that you're interfaced with, or both?
Oh yeah, we have a scanning and archiving application. So that brings up a good point, because a lot of times the interface with some of these other systems can be a problem, because, for instance, at Meditech about 8 years ago, when the Conficker virus hit, we had people at Meditech going around and running virus scans manually on every machine and making sure that it didn't have Conficker. And then after that, we shut down all use of SMB shares at Meditech. And thankfully, one of our VPs had the foresight to say, you know what, our software shouldn't be using SMB shares. And that's the problem, though. A lot of these scanning and archiving and other types of machines still require the SMB shares. So even though we've eliminated them from our side as much as possible, we still find that they're in the environment.
Yeah, it's one of my concerns with particular, threat vectors in the medical space are medical images, right? If I'm going in to get a medical image scan of some kind, they quite likely are pulling my previous images, right? And if those are stored on a different system or in a different hospital, they have to get there so that the radiologist or whoever's going to be, usually a radiologist, right, reading my images is going to read it. What if those are tampered with in transit, right? That's one of my, my wife works in an ultrasound department, right? So I'm very in tune with what happens there, and she tells me, how the different systems work and procedures and stuff like that. And I'm always putting my black hat on, going, well, if I were to attack that, how would I do that, right? And now I'm kind of scared that how is the integrity of these images? And this is just one small aspect of overall security in healthcare, right? But how is that done typically?
Well, that's a great topic. Currently, a lot of times people will have their medical data put on a CD and they take it with them, or it can be emailed or something like that in encrypted form to the other organization. But that's a big area right now that we're working on with a lot of other healthcare vendors. There's these initiatives such as the Commonwealth Alliance, where we're all coming together, all the different vendors and hospitals coming together to try to figure out how to make interoperability much easier. So, for instance, we're a big believer in the REST APIs. It's a secure way to do it, but there's still a lot of complications, like how do you get consent to share this information from this hospital with this other hospital? And there has to be a standard format for the data. So a lot of progress is being made there. And I like to hold up interoperability and the REST APIs as one area where security is actually an enabler, because security is built into everything that's done for interoperability, and it's enabling all this kind of exchange. I hope you don't mind if I go on. One of the more exciting projects I worked on years ago was the project to do electronic prescribing. And so SureScripts, started by CVS, had created this network, and we worked with other partners to be able to send prescriptions electronically to different, pharmacies, and then also to receive information back into our system. So, for instance, the pharmacist may say, oh, well, that drug isn't covered under this plan, and the doctor could pick an alternative from a list and send it back. So that was a really exciting project, but it also helped me to see just how complicated these things are. I mean, the specs for this project were multiple giant binders, extremely detailed, and it's exciting that it works now. But that was pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of regulations and restrictions on that too, because certain prescriptions can't be done electronically. I think now today that's up to the doctor's discretion in some cases, right? And then there's like I actually use an app, right? And you can get some prescriptions just mailed to you, so you don't have to go to the pharmacy, which with COVID was super helpful, because now I don't have to leave to go to a pharmacy where conceivably other sick people might be going to get their prescriptions as well. So I mean, in terms of public health, that's fantastic, but there's still restrictions around that, and of course privacy regulations and mitigations against other attacks. You don't want someone getting the wrong prescription, as an example. That's a huge issue in that particular system.
Yeah, and there's also fraud considerations. In fact, in some states, you also have to have biometric authentication in order to e-prescribe certain, narcotic level substances and things like that. So that's good. But there was a recent case in the news even with a EHR vendor that, apparently their product was helping in the prescription of more opiates. I should have read up on it beforehand, but it's worth looking at the story because it's kind of interesting to see how things can go very wrong and can contribute to an opioid epidemic,
Yep. Well, we see that with pseudoephedrine too in the regulations here, and
can't buy pseudoephedrine.
Nope.
Pseudoephedrine.
They've relaxed some of that with COVID, though. You can actually get it through the drive-through window.
Oh, you can?
Yeah, which is interesting.
You can't get whippets either. I went to buy whippets for real purposes, and I had to
scientific purposes.
Yeah,
keep in mind he's a doctor now.
I had to show an ID and go in the back room and sign a form. I was like, "What the hell?" I didn't even think about it. I was like buying for a whipped cream machine, and the guy's like, "Oh, you can use those for other purposes." And I was like, "What other purposes?"
Hey, not only is Doug a doctor, he's actually a real doctor. And just by the way, completely tangential, the city I grew up in is behind me now.
Oh,
awesome.
Justin, it begs a question, though, that I always like to ask people who work in this particular space with respect to security, all the different ways in which criminals are monetizing various attacks and fraud, right? I mean, we touched on prescriptions, we touched on medical imaging. There's some extremely creative ways, which is one of the reasons why I think health records are under attack, because there's different levels of monetization. Do you have some examples as to how that's happening today?
Yeah, actually, a lot of that's insider threat, too. So you see cases where someone, does drug diversion, as they call it. That's one thing that might happen. Another that you might see is people are looking through lots of patient files and grabbing social security numbers and other data so they can do identity theft. But there's also been a lot of local cases where there's been fraudulent medical billing, where people will either set up a fake medical billing company or they're a legitimate hospital or clinic and they bill for things they didn't even do. Sometimes there's kickbacks to patients. The patient comes in, gets a kickback, and they basically use that to do insurance fraud. So there's so many things there. But lately, the biggest scourge has been ransomware.
Yeah.
I think one reason why it's so big is, it's anonymous. It can be done remotely from Eastern Europe. You can get the money out of the hospital, and it's something that is very valuable to the hospital. So it's kind of flipping it around. Instead of saying this information is valuable to us, let's steal it, it's saying, let's just encrypt this data and hold it hostage. So that's been the big thing. And ransomware changes almost every year, though. It's interesting to see how the security community has predicted a lot of things. Like they said, maybe next year we'll see a ransomware worm. And sure enough, WannaCry came along a year later. And then a lot of people were saying, well, maybe they'll start exfiltrating the data. And sure enough, we now see organizations exfiltrating data and saying, if you don't pay the ransom, that's fine. You may get your data back by restoring it, but now we're going to expose you online and show the world this data that you have. So it adds another dimension. So it continues to evolve. Kind of interesting.
What do you see as good strategies that healthcare providers are actually doing to both thwart the ransomware side of this, as well as kind of the overall security aspect of healthcare in general, right? Like, the most important thing is safety and obviously saving lives. And part of the reason that the medical community is at risk or has issue with security is because there's a no latency, no hassle kind of mentality, which it should be, right? So how are you seeing successful security practices or programs being implemented across medical companies?
Well, there's a few different approaches. That's a great question. And it's so true, because patient safety is always the top priority, being able to get to that information no matter what. But we've seen a couple different approaches. Like, for instance, I've seen some organizations that we work with that have a big security team, bigger hospitals, and they really lock things down. Like, when you're in the hospital, you can't go out to the internet at all from any of those devices. And you also see that they do their own penetration testing. They actually test the products that they use. But then another approach that we've also seen effective is some of the smaller hospitals have brought in, virtual CISOs and people like that to help them with their stance. They'll do a penetration test. They'll go through and they'll say, hey, how come these servers aren't updated? Let's get you on a program of regular scanning and patching. Or why is this server not in the DMZ? It should be, and things like that. So it's really great to see. I have to say, I've had some great experiences working with hospitals in that area. But then the final approach that Meditech is really taking, that we're very fond of, and a lot of our partners are excited about, is hosting, a SaaS offering for our customers. I was at one conference, and one of the speakers said, you know what? Hospitals really don't have any business hosting their own email infrastructure, for example, because email is often a vector for attack. You host your own email infrastructure, it brings in all sorts of potential problems and risks that you have to manage yourself, when in reality, you could have a managed email that does a much better job. And so that's kind of our approach now. We're seeing that as well with the software. Being able to have it in the cloud, being able to take updates without downtime, being on the same code base across all these different hospitals. So that's been our approach going forward, and it's exciting.
The scary part for me with that, though, is the internet connection now becomes very crucial, right, to a hospital's operation, right? And of course, there's downtime if all the systems are local, and that's one thing. But if solutions are hosted in the cloud, if they lose internet, that could be detrimental to, in this case, a hospital, right? Hospitals as an example. Obviously, there's other kinds of healthcare, facilities and use cases. But in terms of patient care, and everyone getting frustrated and that being a bad situation, that internet connection becomes extremely crucial.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so there's a few approaches to that. For instance, we have a high availability chart, high availability snapshot, we call it, solution that can be accessed over the cell networks. Another thing is that when customers sign for this offering of the SaaS model, they have redundant internet connections. But there's also a number of customers that will use a product that stores their copies of the current medical records, of patients in the hospital on local devices so that it's easily accessible, in a different machine. So there's a number of different approaches people take, and it varies. It's funny because I said to one hospital security person, I said, I feel like there should be an on-premise backup of the cloud data in case the internet goes down. And some customers said, hey, that's great. But one customer said, no, that's not our use case. Our big worry is we're going to get hit by a tornado and it's going to wipe out our local infrastructure. So we do want some remote solutions. So everybody has to kind of make their own determination there.
You
Go ahead,
integration with you had mentioned integration with medical devices, equipment, and stuff, and I'm assuming those are in the hospital. Are they suitable for transmitting their data over up to you in the cloud?
Oh, well, usually when there's a downtime situation like that, there's no, those systems aren't functioning at that point. Then it's a read-only system at that point. So hospitals have a set of procedures that they do when there's a downtime. They will record things manually and then enter it in the system later. Yeah, it's not ideal, but that's what hospitals are currently doing. And that's something I've talked to a lot of our customers about too is, sure, your staff who work at night know what to do in a downtime situation because updates usually happen at night. But what about your daytime staff? They may not have touched a patient chart in like 10, 20 years, paper chart. So it's important to train staff on that and have that familiarity there too.
So what you talked about the risk of running some of these systems at the hospitals or at stuff. How's the level of risk you guys have had to absorb?
Oh, I see what you're getting at. Yeah, that is one concern we have is that what if somehow we had malware come back to us? Because we've managed that with, very secure VPN solution and a lot of other things that we practice, best practices that we follow. We haven't had that issue yet. And that's something we do worry about. In the public cloud environment where we're hosting our Meditech as a service, the customers will not have access to any of the infrastructure. So that really minimizes that. But our big concern has always been, we go into this hospital and provide support. If they're under attack, could that come back to hurt us? So far, that hasn't happened, and we've been very careful, and it's probably our nightmare scenario. So we take that very seriously.
Doug,
I imagine you do.
Do you think there's a shifting vector for healthcare? A lot of stuff in like the power industry and the nuclear industry, what they saw happening as they started securing all the low-hanging fruit in their organization, hospitals were still sort of out there with that. We're okay. Nobody targets us. We're the good guys. And now as they've been targeted, that shift of a vector out to third parties, because I used to do some HIPAA consulting for doctors, and doctors' offices and dentists' offices and things were horrifically insecure. I mean, they didn't have it. They didn't want it. They didn't want to pay for it. They didn't understand it. And we all know how doctors can be. And it seems to me like that's the obvious sort of movement is to now attack those outside pieces that are connected back to the hospital. So if I can't get in the hospital directly, I come in through Dr. Bennett's office because they've got an open Wi-Fi and an open system. Do you see that being like a thing that's going on?
Other than one thing we have seen is, I won't name names because one policy we have is we don't like to shame partners or hospitals by naming them
we won't tell.
Over again. But there have been cases, where a vendor had a serious malware attack, and because that system was down, it impacted patient care. But also, in some cases, malware could come from a vendor into a hospital environment. I don't know if I've seen that with a doctor's office yet, which is
vendor too. I mean, vendors, the same thing. I mean, they were attacking these power plants through the vendors who were providing supplies and things like that. And I saw that a long time ago with military bases, looking at that very same problem of, I'm not going to attack the military base. I'm going to attack the person who supplies the paper towels to the military base, because they don't have any security. And originally that didn't matter, but now they've got a Wi-Fi enabled truck, and they got Wi-Fi enabled boxes, and on and on and on and on, and they're bringing all that stuff in. And so that creates this new vector for hospitals too. And as hospitals lock it down, it seems like a threat.
No, I see what you're getting at. I think right now the hospitals, unfortunately, are still the weakest link. It's difficult for many of them to do security. Like our bigger customers, because we have some large hospitals, and they do a fantastic job. But then, you get on the phone with some of these small critical access hospitals. They have a tiny IT team. And I really feel for them because, they're just barely able to keep the systems running, and they don't have budget even to update to the latest version of Windows sometimes. So it's a little discouraging. I've often said that, the government needs to do more, provide incentive for security at hospitals. Just like some years ago, there was meaningful use money. When you had an EHR that could do ordering and prescriptions and all these things, you would get money from the government. So that encouraged electronic health record adoption. That was great program. We need something like that now for security. And I've mentioned this to quite a few people, and I'm hopeful that something like that will happen. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, I wrote an exercise once for a hospital. This was quite a while ago, but just literally an exercise to help, like a tabletop, just to help them think about some of these problems, because they really didn't have anything in the way of IT. I mean, they had an IT support person whose job was primarily to, reset the doctor's passwords when they forgot them. But I mean, I wrote a tabletop where they lost their internet connection. They had been hacked. And, immediately there was a lot of awareness started springing up there, because one of the things the first thing it said that really struck me that I didn't know was a radiologist said, we can't even develop film anymore. He said, when I first started, we could develop film on site because we had that capability. Now it's all electronic and digital. And if we lost that connectivity, we would have to ship that film off somewhere and then get it back. And we can't do treatment if we can't do an X-ray. And I was like, okay, I'm going to move a lot closer to a bigger hospital. Okay, right now.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of how the Navy a few years ago moved back to teaching celestial navigation. Yeah. So in case of downtime or cyber attack, they could actually navigate. What a novel idea.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's something that people don't think about because it's so evolutionary. It just sort of sneaks in on you and you go, wow, we get this great new piece of equipment. It doesn't use film anymore. We get this awesome image. It's on my computer screen. It's on my iPad. And nobody thinks about, I can't do that old technique of taking that film and taking it down there and developing it. And we got rid of those people and we replaced that unit with a doctor's lounge.
If someone's diagnosing me based on a medical image and it's on an iPad, I don't want that.
Oh, come on.
I want them to have a really nice monitor with a really high resolution and DPI when they do that, not on an iPad.
I have all kinds of images of you on an iPad.
Well, no, they do have to use only certain approved monitors for things like that. So rest assured of that. You made me think of something else. Another problem has been this dependence on code rather than just physical things. Yeah. So some years ago, our CEO sent around a case study that was done on I think it was called the THERAC 25. It was a radiation machine that, to deliver radiation for cancer treatment. And it used to have these, they call them interlocks that would prevent the machine from overdosing a patient. But over time, they wrote code that controlled the machine. They said, hey, we have code that can prevent it from overdosing. So let's just get rid of those physical interlocks. They'll save money, and we'll just rely on code. But then because of some bugs in the code, it started killing patients randomly. And so they did this whole big case study on it. It's quite the article you can find online. And, we use that in-house to say to our staff, this shows the importance of code quality, peer review, lots of testing.
But that is also how you get superheroes.
It is. Very much so.
I mean, you have a lot fewer superheroes if you lock those machines that can bombard you with gamma radiation down.
No Incredible Hulk, no Fantastic Four.
Like all of them. I mean, it's like, are there any superheroes who are not bombarded with, like, gamma radiation? Spider-Man.
Spider-Man?
Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider.
That was radioactive spider.
It was a radioactive spider, yeah.
Interesting.
Down at the lab, yeah. They didn't have those code locks in place. A spider got in there.
Well, it underscores the I want to fully explore that thread because you've totally distracted me, but it underscores the importance of physical safeguards, right? That we like to think are always in place in ICS, not necessarily, but typically in place in industrial control systems. The same safeguards need to be in place. When you remove those physical barriers and it all goes into software, kind of like VLANs, it opens up avenues for attack because all software has bugs.
And IoT is the same way. I mean, IoT is now another whole cycle of this thing that people are starting to add IoT components and to hospitals and everywhere else, and they're starting to say, well, the sprinkler system is running off Bluetooth, and I've got a drone that flies up and down the hallway to make sure nobody's escaped, and all these other kind of things. I have kind of a twisted view of a hospital, but it's fun.
Well, yeah, Black Hat, there was a great talk, and the guy from Penn Medical, I think it was, showed how their entertainment system could be hacked, and he went through a lot of the systems in the hospital that you might not even think of and hacked those. So that's a serious issue.
When my daughter was being born, we were in this like birthing chamber place, and there was a computer monitor in there. It was like tracking vitals, and I was showing the anesthesiologist who was supposed to be doing my wife's epidural. I was showing him how to switch the terminals on it, and I was picking up different ones from other birthing rooms on the same one because there was like zero security on the whole thing. And guess what the root password was? Tour. it was Tour. It was the first one.
That would be my first guess.
Yeah, it was the first one I tried, and I was able to get into the whole system, and I was like, this could be really bad. And then my wife was going, excuse me, over here, I have something sticking in my back. And, the guy was like, wow. He was like a Linux guy or something. It was weird.
That is like so not true.
Man.
What?
He did not leave the needle.
He did. He was just starting to stick it in, and I was like, oh, wow. I just said, like, oh, wow, check this out. And he was like, what?
In most hospitals, they make you leave the room for the epidural.
They did not.
I thought you were going to say they started watching Netflix on the machine, because I've heard of cases like that where people use a machine attached to an MRI and watch Netflix.
Yeah, this was pre-Netflix, but you could get ASCII porn.
Doug, ASCII porn just doesn't do it for me, man. And by the way, thanks for telling everybody my root password over the internet. Jeez.
You mean ASCII porn or Tour?
We often get distracted especially when our wives are in labor too.
Well, that too.
I have a story about that. It's actually one of my most popular tweets I ever made because I was.
Oh no, we got to hear this one.
Oh, you didn't hear this one?
I don't know. I don't know.
My wife was in labor and she was like, "Oh, look up on that monitor over there. It's the baby's heartbeat." And I'm like, "Is that Windows 95 or 98? Like, what do you think?" I'm like, kind of. I tweeted that and it sparked much conversation.
Well, I checked before we even checked in that the hospital used Linux, so I was like, yeah, I'm not having my kid's not being born in no Windows platform hospital. It's just not happening.
Was it Linux kernel version 2? Is that?
I think it was FreeBSD.
That's not Linux, Doug.
I know, but I was willing to tolerate that.
That's twice I've had to correct you on this show.
Okay, I'm out. I was just like, that's it.
Well, we have the opposite experience when someone who works at Meditech goes into the hospital. They get asked all sorts of questions once they find out where you work. So one of my coworkers said she was in labor in the hospital, and they're like, "Oh, you work at Meditech? Can you help us figure out how to do this and that in the system?"
I can totally see that.
That's like asking the doctor at the cocktail party, like, my elbows get this funny, like, do you want to...
Here's my card, make an appointment.
Yeah.
More questions for Justin.
So, have you seen, let's see, when I first met my doctor up here when I moved, I noticed the lab blocks from a lab agency that had been hacked and had a huge disclosure, and his staff had absolutely no clue that there was any issue with the company they were using. And my question was, have we seen any progression in terms of greater cyber awareness in the hospitals and doctors you guys are interfacing with? Or are they, can you characterize where they are with that?
Well, that's a tough one. A lot of the doctors and nurses I meet are already a little more interested in the tech than usual. I've actually done some presentations just for nurses and physicians and try to help them to understand it. And they're excited to learn it, but, I think I have a kind of a incorrect view of the world, like a Potemkin village. I just see the doctors and nurses that are interested in it. Most of them, I sense, really just want to get the job done. You still see things like people using a PIN of 1, 2, 3, 4 and things like that. Usually what the doctors and nurses complain about most is there's too many clicks, or I have to do all this and type it all into the system while helping the patient. So a lot of times there's a lot of interest in more progressive solutions like voice-to-text type solutions to make their life easier rather than cybersecurity.
Well, but there's some security issues with that too, right? To avoid some of that manual work, you've got to automate things and transfer things automatically. And that's where certainly some security issues could arise where, the medical record system like Meditech, now you're transferring it to a GE machine, but it didn't transfer. Now they've got to enter everything manually. So like that automation becomes important, but that automation also opens up attack vectors.
Yeah, no, there's always something. And, one thing I like to say, I have these 3 themes that I like to use with hospitals and physicians and nurses. And, one is that it is absolutely a patient safety issue. You all need to care about it. Another one is that resilience is important. So, prepare for downtime, figure out how to make your systems come back good. And then lastly, security should be an enabler. It should be something that helps people do their job, doesn't get in their way, doesn't tell them, now you have to type in this 20-character password with mixed characters and all this crazy random stuff just to get in the system. So, like one of the big success stories I've seen is a lot of times the hospitals will use badged access, where they have a badge that they scan in, and when they walk up to the device, it logs them into their session. They have a VDI, virtual desktop. And so now they're right where they left off at some other computer in the hospital, and it was easy to get in for them. So it's exciting to see things like that where it meshes security with convenience.
Justin, how do you implement patient privacy in HIPAA? Give us some insights into that, because I've noticed a change. My wife has worked in healthcare since we've been together. And a lot of things have changed in terms of who can access patient records. How is that instrumented today, and what kind of mechanisms of security controls do we have at our disposal to make sure that only the people that need to see our medical records can actually access them? And just because my friend's in the hospital, I can't go look up their medical record, right? Usually someone gets fired for that.
Yeah. So there's a couple different things. Like some patients might be marked as a VIP or confidential patient. Like if Schwarzenegger came in your hospital, they would do that. So that way it's locked down to a few people. There's also emergency access that might be needed for some people. So, when you go to look at this patient, you don't normally access, it asks for the reason why that you're doing that.
Right.
But then another thing that most hospitals I've seen implement is they'll bring in a solution that does analytics, sometimes using machine learning to go over the audit logs after the fact. And they found what they'll do is they'll say, hey, why were you looking at this patient? And you'll find out that they had no reason to look at that patient, or it was a neighbor. It even flags things like that. Oh, this is a neighbor or a relative. And then once word gets out that they have that ability, they've seen the number of privacy violations just plummet. So that's another aspect of it. So you have the access control, but you also have after the fact.
How do you do, and this is just sort of more of a psych question, but how do you implement these security controls around people who are, like, I've done a couple lawsuits involving doctors, but how do you implement these kind of controls around people who are used to saying, I want it and I want it now, and they also have that card to play, that, oh, this is a matter of life and death card that, I can't do. I mean, I know you were talking about that before about long passwords and things, but how do you balance like security controls with people who say, I want none of this, I want this to be my way, and if I don't get it, it's a threat to patients?
Well, yeah, because it could be a thing where you're accessing the records, and then you're like, well, I want someone else to look at it like really fast before we send them up to surgery, and all of a sudden there's a barrier in place where they can't access that.
Yeah, and I had
the other side of the hospital, and I can't.
And I had a doctor tell me, I was doing this doctor's office things, we were trying to just put like a Wi-Fi password on their system, and the doctor said, that's going to threaten patient care, because if I need to get to this patient quickly, no way I'm going to have time to do all this whacked out logging in, logging out stuff. And it's really tough to and I was wondering if you have any strategies for dealing with people like that, because I don't know any arrogant people myself, but
Well, I don't usually have to deal with the end users too much, but there are a lot of different levels of access control. The dictionaries for access control are actually very complicated. So they'll define, here's an RN access, here's an LPN access, and they'll have different levels of nurses and physicians. So they do get pretty fine-grained, and so that way, they can add that access to anybody. But typically when it comes to patients, a lot of times they can access patients in the hospital that aren't even in their direct care. But like I said, it's logged and looked at very carefully as to why they did that. So a lot of times they'll have to, click acceptance on a screen first. So that's one way that we get around that. We do allow them, but then there's accountability for it.
And I got one more. So how do you see like the threats emerging from wearable med tech? So, probably in the next 10 years, you're going to see patients coming in that have enabled pacemakers and insulin pumps and these kind of devices that now are communicating. How do you see that becoming like a real threat for you, like Meditech software, just because all of a sudden these just random devices are entering your system and you have to somehow protect for that?
Well, typically those systems don't interface directly. Like, for instance, we do have some interface with a drug infusion pump. But the the infusion pump company is handling most of the security aspect of that. So it's on their side. But those kind of wearables and all those different things do scare the heck out of me. The idea that I was watching one show and they gave this woman a pacemaker, I think it was, or a heart monitor, and they just connected it to her iPhone. They put an app on her iPhone. That's how it sent the data back to the physician. And I looked it up, and sure enough, that's a real thing.
Yep. No,
that just scares the heck out of me.
I had an engineer call me a couple of years ago, and his company, I won't mention the name, but he said they were developing a enabled insulin pump that could be implanted in a patient, and that it was they hoped that it was going to be controllable by a phone, and he just wanted to have like a 1-hour meeting to sit down and talk about threat vectors for these kind of things. And, I was like, well, what does it run off of? It's like, like Wi-Fi, the usual Wi-Fi stuff. And I was like, oh my God, this person insulin pump is interfacing with the hospital record system via a Starbucks or something. And I was thinking, yeah, that could be a little bit of a problem, because he just said for him, it was all about patient care and safety for the patient. And they really weren't thinking about, and which is where security came from in the first place, was it was an engineer who was having trouble thinking outside that box of make it work, make it, make sure whatever it does it correctly. And he was like, I don't know, is that a threat? Do you think people could access that data? I was like, oh my God. Mm-hmm. And of course, I started asking about protocols, and they were like, yeah, I think it's going to use like UDP, and I was just like, oh boy, yeah. I was like, yeah.
Yeah, I was at one conference, and a few years ago, I said, I don't see the likelihood of someone trying to kill someone through their remote pacemaker and things like that. That's kind of like nation state type of stuff. But
that's
one guy who was a spook actually said, that kind of stuff has happened.
Well, yeah,
that was interesting, but
there's people that would do that.
Happen in general. Eventually.
I think Tyler said Russians would be his.
Well, bet. Russians, but I could see
Russia's got poison. They've got Windows, really. So that's kind of a more expensive route. Maybe China.
But I mean, if this stuff's wide open, I could see people doing this. I mean, not nation state people, just some, sort of messed up person who says, I want to make a point or I want to make a statement. And, they go down there and start running that, sit out in the hospital parking lot with a laptop and go, hey, look what I can do. Watch me make this guy pass out. And I mean, I could see people doing that.
Please don't do that.
Please don't do that.
How do we, as a security community, then, how do we get involved enough to not get to that point where we allow that to happen? What are the steps? I mean, working with medical companies is, in its very nature, hard to do between the lawyers and the paperwork.
And the ADA or the FDA and all those guys.
So, I mean, if you are a medical company or a medical device company listening to this, or a lawyer for one of those companies, please kind of reach out and figure out good ways. Like a bug bounty program would be great.
Yeah.
Having devices available on the internet, similar to what a lot of the refrigerators, IoT manufacturers are starting to do. This medical stuff is something that should be tested, and it shouldn't require us to either break the law and or have to go through many hoops of lawyers in order to just disclose something. So I think that's something that, from a medical standpoint and a legal standpoint, we need to get more people involved.
Yeah, we've actually engaged independent security evaluators, ISE, a company to do our security testing of our products and infrastructure and things like that. And they're very involved in this space. They do like a IoT hacking village at Black Hat, and they wrote a real nice paper about a patient-centric model of healthcare security, which I thought was pretty cool because it showed all the many different ways that hacking could impact a patient's health. Indirect things like, for instance, going into your file and removing your peanut allergy or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this would be great info to kind of get out to the community as far as where we can more easily get involved. Obviously, we've spent some time at the Black Hat Village, and a lot of that stuff is not available right now. So, if you have anything to plug as far as ways that people that want to do some research, some interesting communities that are looking at these devices, and companies that are easy to work with.
Yeah, no, that's a tough call. I mean, I've seen that some of the medical device companies are extremely security conscious, and they have a lot of these great programs in place already. But it's difficult because I've seen a few people that want to do that locally, and they said we can't get a hold of medical devices cheaply to run the testing on and get to know them,
I mean, that's very similar to the issue that we have with election devices, right? Because of all the companies that are picking the election devices up to either do research and or maybe look for vulnerabilities, as well as nation states that are doing that. So it's not just kind of the medical community, but we need to make a way for people to kind of get involved, have some remote access to some of these devices, and begin looking at the hardware level. There's not enough of us hardware hackers to kind of go around between elections, medical devices, aerospace, automobile, like you name it, and IoT and the gamut of devices that are now smart is starting to get pretty scary.
Yeah, car hacking scares me. From what I understand, the automotive industry, they're way behind as well. Not only that, think about this the next time you go to a car dealer. I mean, all those laptops are just sitting there. You could easily slip a USB in there. Who's to say what their security is? And
why can't you just put the USB in the car?
It scares me personally.
I mean, my car knows more about me than anybody I know. So
yeah, the
your
car has your
more
whole
about
phone,
your state
list, Brian.
Yeah, it has everything. And I mean, who knows how much security they have on the back end of that.
There's not a ton.
Security you keep asking about.
What?
Yeah.
I said, what is the security you keep mentioning?
There really should be a license
data
to
that
hack.
cars have
I'm 007 and I have a license to hack. Certification, you have certain ground rules. You have to prove that you're reputable, get it tested to by some, respectable people that you've worked with, like FBI and things like that. That'd be cool.
I think in certain circumstances that's warranted and does happen today, but I think one of the beauties of hacking and testing things is making it free and open to people to test, their own devices, and opening up to everyone. Similar to how we scrutinize, encryption algorithms.
That's been the argument I made against this insular stuff forever, was that when you say, oh, we're going to get this little select group, and I'm like, but that's not who's going to be trying to hack you.
Right.
Everybody's going to be trying to hack you. It's not going to be just these people. It's going to be everybody on Earth, and some 12-year-old kid will figure it out.
Yeah, you really do need the creative minds of more than one set of people that are used to following a methodology, used to tackling a piece of hardware in a certain way. You really have to have that kind of diversity. When we've worked together with multiple groups inside of, say, like an EDU, where we're looking at a particular hardware device for something like power, it's only when we bring in multiple facets of different disciplines that we actually start to find really good vulnerabilities, and we start to uncover things that we would have never otherwise understood and therefore wouldn't have been able to hack properly.
Well, and I find that talking to the users is the best way to do that, right? And to bring it back to medical devices, ask people that work in a hospital, a medical office, like if they need to, like when push comes to shove and they need to do something, like what do? They'll find the little tricks around certain controls, right? Because out of necessity. And that's oftentimes how we find the best techniques is people that have to do it out of necessity.
I mean, or it's the easy ones, right? Like their laptop's not working, so they connect to the guest Wi-Fi because the guest Wi-Fi is always working.
Yep.
And therefore, that device now works and goes through.
Or I'm just in the hospital and I'm bored. Well, I got nothing else to do. I might as well sit here and figure something out.
It goes back to my son. I'll be so proud when you figure out how to bypass whatever software I have that enforces times, and he just picks up his mom's phone, enters the passcode, goes into the software, and I'm waiting for him to do that and like change my password or something.
Yep.
And then
locked out, Dad. 2-factor
authentication. Like, he'll just steal my key. Like there's no.
You want to see your UB keys again? I get the car this weekend.
You think no one's safe with us? Wait till our children are unleashed on this technology.
That's scary. Yep. Ransomware from your kids.
Yep.
And end users are very good at hacking. I heard a story about how I mentioned they have those badge readers, and you go up and you scan in. Well, some doctors would leave their badge there so the computer wouldn't lock when they walked away. And then apparently there was something that would read your heat signature. So they had this feature where if it could tell if someone was actually seated at the keyboard or not. So they couldn't leave their badge and just walk away. But then people started leaving a cup of hot coffee there. So the end users always find a way.
Absolutely. Hackers will find a way. Well, Justin, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Yes, I am.
3 words to describe yourself.
Well, I think creative, I'm really into a lot of different creative aspects besides computers, a lot of art, things like that. Also, I like to have a lot of fun. I hope I'm a fun person. I think that's important. It really greases the wheels of progress at work when you can have fun together. And then honest. I think honesty is one of the most important traits a security professional can have.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, my first instinct is a 50 caliber, so you can do it from a long ways off. But on the other hand, something like a ricin pellet, like those spies did with the umbrella in London, shoot a little ricin pellet in the person. That's pretty cool too.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
I have to admit I cheated. I looked at the questions ahead of time, and this was the most difficult one. I don't know why, but the best I could come up with was Dances with Squirrels. I love squirrels. They're a lot of fun.
That's great.
They're fun to watch. They're silly. I like to store up food in my drawer at work just like squirrels do. So that's the title I came up with.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
I've never heard of this game, and I think you just make it up.
It's popular
any
in
game
Europe.
I don't know anything about, I would want to go second because see what other people do, learn what not to do. Let someone else make the foolish mistake first.
True European rules.
That's right. Justin, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Well, I'm a big fan of Alexander Hamilton, so I'll pick him.
Nice.
And then, I was thinking about women that really impressed me, like Ada Lovelace or Grace Hopper. One of those 2, that would be cool.
That works.
Justin, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
Well, thanks for having me. A real pleasure.
And with that, we'll take a short break, come back with the security news for this week. Stay tuned.